So my secret, full disclosure, to staying on point today is to wear the most uncomfortable shoes that I possibly could so that I don't belabor things up here. So when I was a kid, I was a big baseball fan. Full disclosure, I grew up on the East Coast, so I grew up a Yankee fan, and it was during the mid-'70s, during the big Yankee-Dodger rivalry. But there was something about that team back in the 70s that you really, when you watched the game, you were watching a true team, how people worked together, and the backstories that they had, even the managers we paid attention to. And I don't know about you, but as I got older and free agencies set in, it seemed to me that baseball went kind of this team of a bunch of individuals wearing the same uniform. It was just a different game. Nevertheless, when the movie Moneyball came out a year or so ago, I was naturally drawn to it. There was the main plotline story of the movie, which was how Billy Beane, the general manager of the Oakland A's, took aside his scouts, the people who had for years been the main drawing point in terms of how you selected your team, and he ignored them and again used statistical evidence, a computer program, to field his team. But for those of you who did read the book, what I was really fascinated by was the underlying story as to how he got to this result, what made him think this way. And the backstory of Billy Beane was really interesting because he himself was actually a very talented ball player. He was heavily recruited in high school and was one of the biggest stars there. When the scouts came to see him, in scouting terms, he had what they would call a full toolkit. So he could run, he could hit, he could power hit, he could throw, he could field, he could do everything. And they also said he looked like a player. So when you would sit in a room with a bunch of scouts and they'd say, yeah, but look at him, you can just tell he's going to be a great player by what he looks like. And the other thing was he had a great batting average. The other thing was, though, that there were so many people going after him that you had that whole pack mentality when suddenly you were at a high school game and there would be all these scouts looking at, this guy had to be a great ball player, otherwise why would all your competition be there? So all of these themes really hit home with me. Not only do they apply in baseball, but they're the types of things we see a lot in professional services, and particularly law firms. And there's been a fair amount of discussion about this at the talent management level, but it drove a discussion inside our company about, oh, I didn't find out how to do this either. Sorry. Anyway, it drove a discussion inside our company about what's the data as it relates to, thank you. What's the data as it relates to law firm performance that really drives us? And again, we were looking at it specifically from the example of marketing and business development and client retention, because that's what we do. And there was this quote in the book from Michael Lewis, that if there could be all of these misconceptions in the game of baseball, what does that tell you about other lines of work? And as we started to discuss this inside Legal Vertical Strategies, we were looking at what is that data that maybe we're not paying attention to. And it drove us to create a new framework that would help us assess situations. And there were two things when you think about the movie, when you think about Moneyball. First, there's this whole idea that you're taking a team that was the poorest team in baseball trying to compete. So you're looking at your situation, and then you're also talking about what data are you not looking at. So when it came to Billy Beane, what happened was he ended up getting recruited out of high school, but when he went to the major leagues, he was a big failure, and no one could understand why. But what they failed to notice, that although he was a great player, he could do all of these great things on the field, if he had a bad day, he threw temper tantrums. He couldn't keep his composure, but no one saw that. When he had a great batting average, he hit 500 for his first 3 years of high school, but when he in his senior year, he dropped to a 300 batting average. No one paid attention to that or asked the question why. And though he looked the part, his dream was actually not to be a great ball player. His dream was to go to Stanford. The only reason he went was he felt pressured by all these scouts and coaches and his own family who said, you can't pass up this opportunity. So it's this idea that even though you look great on paper, what aren't you looking at? Or are you looking at the right data? And are you looking at that data in the context of your situation? And that was really, to me, when you talk about books and business books and leadership books that can influence us. When I read Moneyball, I read it much more as a business book than I did actually as a sporting book. But as I mentioned, inside our company, we wanted to develop a framework that might help us to consider things we weren't seeing when we were advising clients and based on our own experience. And this framework itself is fairly simple. I mean, it takes 3 factors that we probably we all look at most of the time anyway. But it's put in a framework that will help us evaluate the data that we have, maybe consider the data that we haven't looked at, and also to look at it in the context of who we're competing against. So we aren't all the New York Yankees. We all can't compete at that level. So if we're playing, if we are the Oakland A's, we need to consider what are the other, how are we going to change our strategy so we can compete against the larger players in town. Or if you are competing against someone who looks like you, how are you going to differentiate yourself? So these 3 factors were the indicators we believe that drive performance in the legal industry. A typical way you might use this, so demand goes to how much work is there, how much work is out there, and it's not just a question of quality, but it's also a question of quantity. It's also a question of the value. So you want to look not just does litigation exist, but what is the relative value of that, and is that the type of work that's going to be profitable for you? On your target market, it's not just about how many people have this need, but what do those people look like? And again, when you look at the competitive landscape, it's not just what other law firms, but what are the characteristics of those law firms that are going to make them more competitive than you in the market? So if you were to take this with just a typical example that many of us have probably faced, take that example of a lawyer who wants to start a new practice group. Right? He's just won a big case in a very unique area of the law. He thinks he can replicate it. And lawyers have gotten in the room. They said, yes, I've seen this out there before. I know that there's need. And this is a specialized area, so I know that we can attract high fees for it. Or we know that this is in specific need of large public companies or of multinationals, and that's our target market, so we know we can do that. And when you get all these highly experienced people in one room giving that advice, it sounds good, but is the data there to support it? So one way you might apply that, and I'm just going to hit this at a real high level given our time, but one way you might apply that is you're going to start and look at, okay, well, what is demand? So maybe you're going to look at litigation filings. Let's say that this particular attorney, the case involves the intersection of antitrust and IP law. So you're going to look and say, okay, how much IP and antitrust law is out there? And if you look at it, that's a fairly specialized areas of law. So that's complex work. You're going to get decent values for it. And when you look at the trend lines on that, maybe you'll see that, wow, there is a lot of work in this area. But are you looking at it over a time period? So you want to make sure you're looking to see if it's increasing or decreasing. And is it complex work? Is it truly bet the company work? So maybe you want to filter that data and look at it just by the specific class action work, because you know that by nature is going to be a little bit more complex. And maybe what you see when you filter out and only look at class actions is there's really very little of that work out there. That doesn't make it a bad scenario for developing a practice group, but you want to be able to evaluate that data. So in this scenario, let's say, so here you have the 4 different categories of work that we've defined. Again, very simple, something that's easy to take out to your attorneys. And you can say, okay, our trend line is showing that if we're gonna market in that area, our greatest opportunity is with complex work. The next step would be to look at your target market. Here again, you don't want to just look at how many people have it, but you want to look at the characteristics of the company itself. There's a lot of different ways you're going to slice and dice this data, but what we like to consider first is the size of the company. And we think that's important because it goes very much to how you're going to position yourself and how you're going to sell to clients. The way multinationals and large public companies buy is very different than the way a middle market company buys. So if you're looking at this from a marketing strategy, you want to have a very clearly defined audience and not do the typical, which is we represent everyone from multinational to emerging companies and try to have just one message that's going to fit there. So perhaps when you look at the underlying data, you take those cases and you look at the companies that are impacted by that data. What you'll find is that the real market is in the middle market client. So now you've identified who has the problem and you've identified what type of work that you have. This is your opportunity identification. And with this data, you're now in a position to, one, before you look at the competitive landscape, but also have a real conversation with your attorneys about the value of this opportunity. So perhaps if you're a middle market firm and this is where you're competing, this could be a great opportunity for you. You're right in your sweet spot. But when you're thinking about how you're going to be competing against people, you're looking at how you compete with the people you compete with every day. That was wordy. So your question about marketing might become a differentiation question. How are you going to differentiate if you're competing against people who look just like you? At the same token, if you're a larger firm and your typical marketing strategy is invested around bet the company, multinational corporations, and this is a middle market, you have to have a real gut check as to whether this is the right opportunity for you. It may very well be. Southern California is a great example where we're seeing a lot of the larger firms move downstream. It's not a wrong strategy, but you need to look at it because you're going to have to invest marketing and business development resources perhaps a little bit differently than the rest of your firm-wide initiatives if you're in other markets. So you need to have an honest conversation about that. But the idea behind this is that using a framework like this, or any other framework, but something like this, it gives you the opportunity to evaluate the data, to validate, is what we think or what we see with our own eyes, is that really true, or are there other factors that we need to be considering? It also helps you determine, what the opportunity really is. And what we've found in working with law firms on this, once you know specifically what it is you're trying to accomplish, making those really difficult decisions about should we be marketing at the industry level or the practice group level? Should we be marketing a practice group or an individual attorney? These conversations become much easier once you have a specific context in which that you're trying to accomplish. We found it's more effective and efficient in how you invest your marketing and business development resources, and at the end of the day, your return on investment is a lot higher. So just as a little takeaway for this, today's panel was really all about, this section is all about thinking differently. From the context of Moneyball, what we really learned from that was not so much that we should be looking at data to make decisions. I think to some extent we all do that. The evidence that's out there, we want to do our best to make those decisions using the information we have. But like baseball, statistics have been around since the beginning of the game. We've always had the statistics. What was different about Moneyball was how they use the data and how they analyze the data in the context of a specific situation. So the performance index is just one tool that you can do this, but I'd encourage all of you, as you look to make better business decisions going forward, that we just take the time to look at the data, make sure what we see is accurate, consider what we aren't looking at, and again, contextualize that in the context of the specific situation at hand. If anybody would like more information about the performance index itself, we've got some information on our website. I'll also be here through lunch today, and it's a topic near and dear to my heart, so I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. Thank you.